friends and neighbors, I said that. It is a work session of the Stayton City Council. It is Thursday, the 15th of September in the year 2022. We're here at the Community Center for a work session. I already said that. And council's here, along with the staff is here. And I'm going to turn this over to our city administrator, Julia. Would you take us through this, please?
I will be happy to. First, a few logistical things. We had some technical difficulties, which Alyssa and Tammy masterfully navigated, but they wanted me to remind you guys to speak loudly into your microphones because we don't have the same camera setup that we have had in the past. So to make sure anybody watching at home can hear you, please speak loudly into your microphones. I also wanted to introduce Carrie Conley is an attorney with Local Government Law Group. She's here and she's going to actually lead us through the bulk of the presentation, as well as Captain Johns with our police department. We do have some folks in the audience that have interests as well as some people watching from home, but this is a work session, so it's really for council and council discussion, and we'll take it from there. You do have your presentations in front of you, but I wanted to start just to kind of set the stage for what I believe the meeting purpose is, which is to discuss homelessness in Stayton and what we're doing and can be done to support the homeless population while also protecting livability and business vitality in the community. We envision this as the start or continuation of a conversation, but we recognize that there isn't a simple or easy answer. And we expect that the outcomes will be identification of potential next steps and development of action items for us to have additional conversations and potentially work sessions going forward. Tonight, we're going to review the data on homelessness, discuss some local observations and complaints that we receive, review Boise versus Martin and other case law, discuss what we're currently doing, as well as some new laws, and then we'll open it up for conversation. Throughout the presentation, we do have some points where we are pausing to take questions before we move to the next topic, but of course, if you have questions at any time, feel free to speak up. This is intended to be fairly informal. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Carrie, who's going to lead you through a lot of the background on this topic.
Great. If anybody didn't remember. Okay, so if anybody does have anything to chime in as I'm moving through these, especially the preliminary slides, we're hoping to move through rather quickly. The goal is to give you the framework, the backdrop on which these new laws were thrust upon us, to try to sort of explain the why of it all. I know that you've been provided some information. The League just, you know, slowly making its way around. Everybody's dealing with this crisis. And the term I'm going to use tonight primarily is homeless, the homeless crisis. As they used here, there is also a lot of terminology developing around unhoused, experiencing homelessness, unsheltered. All of that really is the same way of saying what we're talking about in terms of the homeless crisis, but because homelessness is the term used in the statutes, that's what I'm going to stick with tonight. And so I understand it can be insensitive to certain members of that population, I've heard, so I just am giving that little disclaimer up front. I did want to tell you a little bit about myself. So I'm the senior partner at Local Government Law Group. I've been there since 1997. My current partner, Mark Wolf, was 13 when I started, and he was the son of the partner at the time who hired me. So, you know, I'm like, it's really a family firm. We all love working with you. We love working with local governments. We understand your the pressures that you're under, the struggles that you have, and you know, so don't shoot the messenger. I know that this is a lot of this isn't pleasant or great news, but we are here to help you, and we help a lot of communities through. We are helping a lot of communities through the same questions, policy choices, struggling to balance the law requirements against public property management priorities. So I have given this presentation or various permutations of it to a number of other cities, and I'm working with those cities. I know you're used to seeing Ross Williamson, also my partner, and he will most likely be stepping in, and he and I may work together on helping you decide and then implement how you want to move forward from here. But because I'm the one that has given this presentation most recently, we just thought it would be most cost effective for you if I stepped in just to go through the slides, give you the backdrop. So that isn't to say at all that Ross isn't as qualified as I am to help you with these new and different problems. So let's see, just know also that the slides are, as I said, trying to give you some context, and I defer to your knowledge. You have more knowledge than I do of your local circumstances. Staff has chimed in to try to update the slides and tailor them for your specific circumstances, but just know that I'm not trying to tell you what you know better than I do. And so homelessness is the definition in the PSU uses lacking regular access to safe, adequate, and stable housing. So it is commonly discussed that homelessness is primarily attributed to the lack of affordable housing, but a number of other causes are associated with that homeless population, which is homeless population, insufficient income, poverty, mental illness, substance abuse, foreclosures, and domestic violence. So what is just commonly stated is that those suffering from homelessness, it exacerbates all of those other, it's either also caused by or certainly exacerbating all of these other issues that these individuals are suffering.
And I think I've got this slide. It's going to lead into some context that Carrie's going to give you in a second as well on affordability, but just a reminder on Stayton and some demographic information. The average household income is $64,631. The poverty rate is 8.2%. The median rental cost is about just a little over $1,000 per month. The median housing price, actually I think this is low based on my house search. So this is like the data is a few years old as well, just from the census information, but 278,000, I know that's low. The population from the census, and I think this must have been a 2020 census, is 8,203, is closer to actually about 8,400. There was a homeless point in time count, and we'll talk about that in a few slides as well, that was done in January. They identified 9 persons through that point in time count. So we're sort of estimating around 10 because they probably didn't catch everybody. And we'll talk a little bit more about that as well.
So this slide just supports the last slide I discussed about the various causes of homelessness. As you can see, the division between male and female tends to be equal, 49%. Nearly half suffer from a mental health disorder. There's an equal number of homeless individuals who receive some kind of income and no income. And this is from a study, a 2022 study, but I just want to point out that our data is a little spotty. It starts, there's some from 2018 all the way through to 2022. So the 2018 stuff probably has been exacerbated between now and then. So that data just extrapolate out. So the point in time count Julia. Okay, sorry, I was just like, how formal do we need to be? That Julia was talking about. So Stayton's point in time identified 9 individuals. The county study involved Marion and Polk, and that region included 879 unsheltered individuals. I think one of the primary points to draw from this is there was a 20% increase in unhoused individuals in 1 year. And I know of those 9 individuals, the local population is usually known to your law enforcement, if not to you personally, especially if it is chronic homelessness. In one of the cities that I'm helping, the city staff knew all of the individuals well, and in particular those who were actually employed but still unhoused because they couldn't locate affordable housing, which leads right into the next slide.
Yeah, and I just want to pause for a moment and just mention, I spoke with the person that helped with the point in time count in Stayton, and what they did is they went out with a police officer days and weeks before the point in time count and told them about, here's where you go, here's how it works, and so that's, I think that's how we got 9 individuals. It wasn't like they just showed up at a certain spot. So.
Great.
Can I ask any questions anytime, or do you want us to wait for a minute?
Yeah, I think ask.
Please.
Okay. Yep. You kind of answered a little bit. So the point, who did the point in time count, and then is that counting? I know it said public and outside areas, but is that counting like down by the river? And at one time there was like an encampment over by like kitty corner to Roth's.
So my understanding is that it was actually here at the community center, but what she did, and it was coordinated through the Mid-Valley Homeless Alliance, and Kim with our service integration team is actually she's the one I talked to and was helping to do that. She went out with a police officer prior to the count and met with the homeless individuals throughout the city, let them know about the count and what day it was going to be on. Said, come, there'll be free coffee, there'll be service assessments available, clean sleeping bags, and so basically it was inviting people to the facility to get their to have their homeless assessments. Is my understanding.
So they were only counted if they came.
Yes.
Okay, so that's not a.
Well, it's certainly not. I mean, that's the point in time count. It's not a census. It's the sort of they're doing the best that they can with the resources.
Sure. Okay, I just want to make sure what information we're using.
Yeah.
My experience is that the point in time procedures vary widely from community to community, and so it can be going from camp to camp. It can be the invitation to come in. There's just, it's incredibly hard to know at any one time how many unhoused in that population do we have. So instead, we turn to, oh, I'm sorry, yes?
No, I just was going to ask a follow-up on that. Does that organization, Mid-Willamette Valley Homeless Alliance, have any estimation procedures for this based on their experience in the field with trying to identify these folks and quantify them?
Yeah, I don't, you're going to answer.
They've been
so
doing
I'm
this for
sure I
years,
understand.
actually. Like here in Stayton, they've been doing this point in time count for many, many, many years. And it's usually broadcasted on like our community pages that it's coming up. You can help volunteer for it. It's very well known here in the San Diego Canyon. There's even a great stretch all the way up the canyon that does this. So it's really well organized. New Hope Church, I think, also is usually involved in it most years, I think. I'm not sure if they were this year, but my question is just about, based on the police officer's knowledge of this, did it seem like 10 was reasonable for a number based on the types of contacts that clearly have been had?
I think based on who we routinely deal with, our officers usually come up with the 12. Now, we get people in vehicles that come and go, but the ones that we routinely see that are kind of more everyday. But again, that kind of ebbs and flows, right? Depending on some different stuff. And we'll have some people that stay for a few days and find somewhere else that they choose to stay, or stay for a couple weeks. maybe some other options come up. So based on what I've seen and the repeat people that we deal with, it's not too far off.
And I think it's probably more helpful to look at that countywide or even statewide number because, you know, if they are going to be in different locations at different times. And so I think looking at the whole point in time count, it probably is undercounting, but it may not be significantly undercounting.
Well, and what I'll say too is like, I think sometimes there's assumptions. So there's a gentleman that hangs out at Roth's, and we've heard routinely like this homeless guy that hangs out there, and he actually has an apartment. So I think sometimes there's assumptions, you know, based on people that are seen in certain areas and what their activities are, and they may not actually fit into this criteria.
Thank you.
Real quick, I just want to circle back. Thank you for the explanation, Councilor Hook. I appreciate that. But I'm really curious, is there any methodology for estimation for these communities? I mean, these folks are self-selecting this point in time count, you know what I mean? So that's kind of a flawed way of collecting data. And to Councilor Ward's point, we're not going to really be able to make a lot of good decisions off that. So I just was wondering if they had a methodology for that. If they don't, that's totally fine. We can move on.
If you don't know, I'm sure there is a methodology. It's a very well-established program and system throughout not just the state, but the country. I just don't know what it is, but we can find out more information.
Hi, this is Dan. If I may butt in here a bit, yes, there is a methodology. The methodology, to a certain extent, is guided by the Federal Department of Housing and Urban Development. The local, meaning Marion Polk point in time count, has been going on for at least 10, 12, 15 years. They made a significant effort this year to contact the local officials. Some of them was in my office asking about where, who, how. I sent them over to talk to the police department. You know, so I think they make as best of an effort as they can. And also want to remind you, as is in the slide on the screen, the point in time count takes place in January, and particularly here in Stayton, we may have significant seasonal fluctuation. You know, June, July, August, September, we probably have a few more folks than we do in December, January, and February.
Thanks, Dan. I will mention that Dan and I believe Lance is also here remotely, so if they chime in, that's helpful. Okay. So, sorry, we'll move on to the affordable housing discussion.
And I'm thrilled that people are chiming in because, you know, your local data isn't my area of expertise. But what we can see is that the incidence of homelessness can't currently be addressed by the number of units that are available. In Marion County, there's a 31% unmet need for housing units. I think that that's the most important thing to draw off of here. Affordable housing is one of the critical elements to address homelessness, and the region has a 1,200 unit deficit. And that was in October of 2020.
And the region is the Mid-Willamette Valley.
It is the Marion and Polk counties, which I think is Mid-Willamette Valley. Yeah. So kind of broadening the lens a little bit, looking at Oregon. Oregon has high rents, you know, something that we're all pretty aware of just from our personal pocketbooks. And a report found that those high rents will contribute to a growing homeless population going forward. Oregon hasn't expanded its emergency shelter capacity to match the size of the homeless population, or what I would think of more as just to match our growing population. Oregon just has an incredibly growing population. In 2018, Oregon had the second highest rate of unsheltered homeless people in the country. And we had the third highest rate of chronically homeless people. Again, that was 2018. So keeping on widening the lens here, you can see along the vertical axis is, whoop, I need my glasses, is the number of homeless individuals. And then the median rent is the horizontal axis. And you can see where the West Coast is well represented above that median line, Oregon, Washington, and California. And Oregon being, I think it's the 8th highest rent of all the states in the country. So that's translating. Oh, I'm sorry. So let's move to Stayton's homeless complaints.
Yeah, so we wanted to bring it back home a little bit. So Carrie's giving you a little bit of the bigger picture, but Gwen is boots on the ground. So you want to take this slide?
Yeah, and to let you know, we'll have some other discussion about what we are doing, what we can do, and what's our response. But this is talking about what sort of complaints that we do receive here in Stayton. People sleeping in cars on public property. Usually those are, pretty obvious ones. I would say there's additional people that kind of go unnoticed because they aren't attracting attention either through their vehicle or their behavior. But we do have some chronic vehicles that attract some attention and complaints. People sleeping under eaves on public property, including community center and library, might be private businesses and places downtown as well. People sleeping in parks, under picnic shelters, people camping in the parks, litter, concerns about drug use and paraphernalia. And what I'll just kind of add here, sometimes they're accurate and sometimes not. So we'll get calls that someone's smoking meth. We show up and they've got a vape pen. And so we do have to dig into those and see what the complaints are, if they're valid, and address them appropriate. And concerns about biohazards left behind. And what I'll say too, in regards to this is our approach is problem solving as much as we can, and what are our resources and availabilities. So often when we're dealing with it, obviously we want the issue to be resolved and resolved long term if we can. And so we're often asking, how can we help? Like, what's gonna fix this and what's gonna be a long-term approach to that? And we have driven people to shelters. The chief personally has driven people to Albany before. I've personally driven people to Salem. And so as much as we can, connecting them with resources. We have a Marion County mental health team that we will call to come in and do assessments there as well. Sometimes the hospital is an appropriate resource, depending. So we are trying to problem solve the situation, immediate and long term, as best we can.
And we'll get more into that in a few slides after Carrie gives you a lot of case law stuff. But so I think thank you for saying that. We wanted to kind of highlight, this is what we're hearing, and then we're going to talk about the law, and then here's what we're doing, and then we will have more discussions on what more we might need to be doing. But I think that's good context. Question. The next slide is questions about the background.
I saw that. I have just a question about the last bullet point that said concerns about biohazards left behind. Was there any things like that substantiated like those claims that there were? Is this an actual problem or just a concern in people's minds that it could be a problem? I mean, currently, not a year or two ago, but this year.
I think it's both. I mean, we do have like human waste, right? Is that a concern for people that have to come clean it up? Absolutely.
Yeah.
And so that has been a concern, and we work with parks, and Bob's wonderful. It's not a pleasant thing to take care of, and Bob's good about getting out and cleaning up and helping with that, as well as the police officers. I will say, when we say this is the police approach, I personally, the chief personally, have gone out and cleaned things up. I personally haven't seen needles I know that's been a concern. Not to say that it hasn't happened, but I personally haven't seen. Sometimes there's some, concerns about drug paraphernalia. It just kind of,
And when I put biohazards, it was a nice way of saying human waste. So that's really what I've heard concerns from staff about, not necessarily from the public. I don't know if you've received word.
I think that's, often it's the fear, right? And then sometimes there's some reality. I wouldn't say it's overwhelming based on the feedback I have or what I've seen outside of the human waste.
Our bathrooms in Pioneer Park, and I know there's some parks, I don't know if all have a porta potty, are they open all night or are they closed at a certain time?
They had been closing and locking.
They lock at 8.
Park restrooms have automatic locks.
They lock at 8
Lock
o'clock.
at a certain time.
Yeah,
But
and-
that doesn't mean that they can't be
Bypassed.
jeopardized.
Right, and the reason behind that is we don't want someone camping in there, right, and they can't, it's, so, yeah, so they do close.
Any other questions on this background information before we move into the law? Okay.
All
Take it
right,
away.
yeah, so, this is really why we're here, because, so the incidence of homelessness was increasing, particularly on the West Coast. Historically, courts would enforce prohibitions prohibitions on uses of objectionable uses of public space. So you have on your books, we'll talk about it a little bit, hours that your parks are closed. You have on books, or other cities have on their books, no camping in our public spaces, no sleeping on certain park benches, et cetera, et cetera. And traditionally those were upheld. And then suddenly in 2018, the Ninth Circuit had this challenge in front of them, Martin v. Boise, and somebody argued it's cruel and unusual punishment to criminalize behavior that is unavoidable for being a human. And I know that this group, or at least most of this group, has had a training on what happened under Martin v. Boise, so I don't need to spend a lot of time talking about that, but I just wanted to use that as the bedrock reminder. It's stemming from a Ninth Circuit case. It's an 8th Amendment to the Constitution. So the federal Constitution is now prohibiting cities from criminalizing sleeping, lying, keeping warm and dry in public spaces. And essentially that just boils down to not being able to enforce laws on the books that would prohibit certain uses of public property. And so that is, I kind of have a little anecdote about, I grew up in Oregon, I'm an Oregonian, I grew up in the Dalles. I did not know what homelessness was. I had never seen a homeless person except for the little bit of time that the Rajneesh imported individuals from the streets of LA in an effort to try to take over Wasco County. And then for a couple weeks, we had people on our streets and we were just like, I don't even know what this is, never experienced it. So that just gives some perspective and context to what we're now seeing on our streets. That it's a dramatic change. And, that the courts tend to follow current developments. They try, the Constitution is a growing, breathing document, and it addresses circumstances as they change. So whereas we were very used to having our standard laws enforced, suddenly we're handed this change. And it was, I think, a result that, look, nothing's happening on the federal level, nothing's happening on the state level. So guess what? You local communities are going to need to do something. Because Martin v. Boise only applies if there's no alternative shelter available.
Carrie,
Lucky,
is
yes.
this going any further? Like, is it being tried any further up the chain, or this just is what it is?
So that case in particular was appealed to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court denied cert, so they wouldn't review it. I think the argument at the time with that Supreme Court was the Supreme Court's job is to try to reconcile various opinions nationwide, and this was a standalone decision. I also, though, think it may be politically motivated because that makeup of the Supreme Court doesn't have much of a liberal bent, and they may just want to punish the West Coast. I have no idea, but it was anticipated that they wouldn't accept cert in advance, and then they didn't. But what was found, so the result of Martin v. Boise was that communities just started scrambling, like what's enforceable, what isn't. We don't have any bright line test. And specifically, there's a bit of Martin v. Boise in a footnote that claims this is a very narrow holding. So it wasn't intended, or at least the writer didn't intend it to have this sweeping effect. But it is a narrow holding that had a very sweeping effect, because they were saying it doesn't cover individuals who have access to adequate temporary shelter. And then even where shelter is unavailable, an ordinance prohibiting sitting, lying, sleeping outside at certain times or in certain locations, it might be constitutional. They didn't go so far to say it is constitutional. And then also barring obstruction of public rights of ways or the erection of certain structures might be constitutional. This just left us in a huge flux. And the other element they tossed into this footnote was that they had previously called out sitting, lying, sleeping outside, but at the end you can see that it also may apply to punishing people for lacking the means to live out universal and unavoidable consequences of being human. And that could be defecation. That could be, we don't know what that means. It's hard to outlaw something that is part of being human. Taking drugs probably isn't part of being human. But anyway, that just really opened the door to the unknown. All we know is that some time, place, and manner restrictions are constitutional, could be constitutional under Martin v. Boise, and that any restriction is acceptable if there's access to shelter, access to adequate shelter. So the clear direction, this was a summary. League of Oregon Cities just issued a guide this summer to persons experiencing homelessness in public spaces. This is an effort to reconcile the law that's out there and help communities know what they can and can't do. But unfortunately, the clear direction is very minimal. You can't punish a person who's experiencing homelessness for sitting, sleeping, or lying on public property when they have nowhere to go. You're not required to build shelters. You can impose traditional restrictions on persons who have access to shelter, and you're allowed to build shelters. But as I was pointing out before, the questions are very broad. What other acts are human conditions that you're now not allowed to restrict? What time, place, manner restrictions are constitutional? What prohibitions can you impose to keep your right-of-ways clear? We don't really know. And what specific prohibitions can cities impose that will prevent a person experiencing homelessness from erecting a structure? So again, are we allowed to limit tents that are over 6 feet? Are we just allowed to eliminate circus tents? Are we, anything that's involves nails and wood, can you prohibit that? We don't really know where that spectrum goes. And the interesting thing about the league guideline that I wanted to point out is that the team that drafted this, we're going to talk about Blake v. Grants Pass. So the attorney who argued that for Grants Pass and multiple city attorneys got together to craft this guide. And they were specifically asked by the league, can you craft a code that's going to meet the laws in place? And they looked at each other and were like, absolutely not. Because it's really factually specific. It really depends on the laws that you have on the books, the type of adequate shelter that's available, the number of homeless individuals, the number of units, of housing units that are available. So they just threw up their hands, and this is what we got instead,
Carry
which is
on.
really helpful, but not what we were hoping for.
I have
Yes.
a couple questions.
Yeah.
Okay.
And
How-
just a reminder to speak loudly into the microphone.
How do you differentiate between people who are housed and unhoused or have shelters? It says on here that you can't make someone move from a space if they don't have adequate shelter, even if it's temporary. But if we know there are people that are in the community that have been offered places to stay and they refuse them by like family members and things, how do we navigate that? When they have a place to stay, but they choose not to.
Well, I think a good example is the individual who is known to have an apartment. So if you know that they have an apartment that is theirs, I think that you can enforce the laws on your books as to that individual. But anybody else, you thinking, or law enforcement thinking that they have adequate shelter, we have to look at it from their perspective. We don't know if it's adequate. We don't know what adequate means. Is it that they just had a fight and so they were kicked out? Is it that because they have a dog and that housing doesn't allow dogs and they're not willing to give up their dog? So this is the plight that law enforcement was thrust into, and in response, so the game that everybody played was, let's tally the number of units of housing available, and if there are enough units of emergency shelter beds available, we will enforce against certain individuals and assume that they can go there. So they're not going there by choice, which leads us to the next case. So like the City of Grants Pass, that's exactly what they were trying to do, was enforce their laws to the extent they thought was permissible under Martin v. Boise, because they thought, well, we're counting all of these beds as adequate temporary shelter that's available to these individuals. And they were counting BLM land, they were counting church shelters, they were counting, there was something else that they were counting. And so Grants Pass was issuing citations and bringing people into court because they were saying, this is your choice. Your choice is that you're on the street. You actually have some place to go, and we can tell you all the different places that you can go. And one of the plaintiffs, Blake, successfully appealed and or challenged, I guess, those citations. And one of the elements so there's three things that came out of Blake. The first is that the city was saying you get to sleep here, but we're taking your pillow, your blankets, anything that's helping you stay warm and dry. And the court said, absolutely not. You cannot be taking those items in order to try to force them off the street. Some things seem a little common sense, but anyway, it's nice to know that you cannot, that individuals are allowed to stay warm and dry and allowed to carry around materials with them. And the most important thing, I think, is actually the next thing.
Sorry, yeah. This was split among two slides, so if you're looking in your packet, that's why she's kind of speaking out of two slides, but go ahead.
Okay, right. And but this is the slide that I think is the most helpful because it tells us what doesn't count as alternative shelter. So a church-affiliated entity is not alternative shelter if it has strict rules and requires mandatory attendance to church activities. Federal BLM land, Josephine County land, or state rest stops are not alternative shelters. There's restrictions placed on those lands. There are federal lands. There's time limits on those lands. And warming shelters can't count if they don't have enough beds, if they're not available consistently on a night-by-night basis, which really no warming shelter is that I'm familiar with. They usually open during just cold periods. Or they don't have enough capacity, or they don't take families, or they don't take animals. All of these considerations eliminated what law enforcement reasonably thought constituted an alternative shelter. And when I point at Captain Jones, I don't mean that she thought this. I'm just using you as an example of that community. community of law enforcement. And so it's tough. You know, enforcement threw up their hands and they were like, we don't know what we can do. And how can you investigate on a case-by-case basis? Do you have adequate housing or not, to find out if they had a home, to find out if they had family in the area?
So for clarification, a federal court said that cities cannot do these certain things, can't place restrictions on people, but it said that federal land can have restrictions and can get people off of them, and they're not suitable for counting as places for people to stay.
Right, and I don't know if that was because they don't have beds, they don't have facilities. It's also because the facilities that Grants Pass was pointing to were out of town, down the highway, so that's dangerous. So that it is a really fact-specific evaluation of what qualifies as adequate alternative shelter. What was the other aspect of that?
Can the federal government have restrictions on?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that was.
So I was actually gonna say,
Yeah.
is like Mount Shasta, for example, you can only camp there for 7 days and they have it posted all over the park. So that also then qualifies as a place that's not always open for someone to access. And so that's how it can't be counted as a place for you to consider as adequate.
That's a really,
But
right.
But then why can Mount Shasta say that you can't camp there? And you can only be there for 7 days?
it's federal.
Because it's,
But I
I'm
know.
just using Mount Shasta as an example.
No, I know, but I guess I'm just frustrated with the.
well, let's take the federal component out of it.
Well, I know, but
because-
I'm just saying, like, they're making these rules for us to follow, and then they are not even giving access to people to be on that land. But we have to give access on our public spaces.
Right, so there's a fairness element there that is just, I can't break it down for you. But what I can say is that the campsites that you're talking about, and the point I was gonna make about the BLM land, is that it needs, the property that's subject to Martin v. Boise and Lake v. Grants Pass has to be open generally to the public. So if it's restricted to certain camping limitations, that isn't just open city property. It needs to be undedicated for a different purpose. So that's why city parks and rights of ways and sidewalks and everywhere else, you know, anything that is just generally accessible, all of a sudden that became subject to these laws.
Can you also speak to, because it's not in here, but I know I've read it somewhere, that it's not just like what generally accessible means, and it's not, well, there's a shelter in Salem, for example. I mean, can you speak to that, where like how the proximity for availability?
Well, I think, I guess the BLM piece is instructive. So if there is an agreement, say, between, you know, we just heard of an example of taking somebody to a shelter, and I think that it is from the perspective of the individual. If they are willing to go there and they are thrilled that you're providing alternative shelter, or that there is an alternative shelter in a different community, great. But you can't say you have it available to you, you're choosing not to go, you're not letting me take you there, therefore I'm going to issue a citation. So, you know, again, come back around to the homeless individual's perspective. Is it adequate from their perspective?
But if they are offered it, so this is just a question, if they are offered it and it is, you know, somewhere that is available all the time for them, and it's, say, free, can you then enforce your sit, lie standards, those ones, not like, you know, punishing them for camping there, but like the sit, lie ones that are already in place? Because I think I saw on a different site that you could.
Or you're supposed to be able to.
But then these things are kind of like saying that you can't.
It's just,
That's why it's confusing.
well,
So I
no,
wanted you here.
it's a risk analysis. And so that's why in the local focus, all of these different communities are strategizing, what are we going to develop? Who are we gonna partner with? Partnerships are just like a critical element of all of this with various social services who can run and manage these sites so that you actually can rely on it and say, we know we have alternative shelter available. It is in our community. It's how can they say it isn't available? It doesn't discriminate on familial status, pet status. Actually, let's talk about the next slide, because that is, again, this is where we drew, it needs to be low barrier. So I don't know if you've heard that term before, but the alternative shelter needs to be low barrier. And what that means, primarily, it's all of these. You can't discriminate based on gender, age, disability, or familial status. A lot of these shelters won't allow families in because they don't want responsibility for children. So suddenly families then have no alternative shelter available. But the last one is really critical in the communities that I'm talking to. So you have to allow access for individuals currently under the influence of some substance, alcohol or drugs, and you can't exclude them for their criminal, past criminal behaviors. And a lot of shelters draw a line. They don't want somebody under the influence. They don't want somebody in there that they think is a high risk. And all of a sudden, their facility is taken off the table. You can't consider it as an alternative shelter. And so there's a lot of discussion around low barrier. And yes, we want to provide alternative shelter, but we don't want it to be low barrier. And all of a sudden, then it can't be counted and it can't be pointed to as a basis to enforce local regulations.
And I also want to highlight where we're going with this presentation, and we will get there, I promise, is these are the restrictions if there is no alternative. So the question is, what alternatives are available? If you have, I'm jumping ahead a little bit, but if you have like 2 sites in the city where you're like, you can camp, you can be there, that's fine, then you can restrict that other places. And so that's, ultimately we're going to have those conversations going forward. But I just don't, it's not to say that you can't regulate it anywhere. It's just you can't regulate it if these things don't exist anywhere.
Yeah, we're going to come. Yeah. Really, I promise you, we will come to the spectrum of options, and nobody is asking you to even come up with ideas or any options on that spectrum right now. I'm just letting you. This is all a lead up to letting you know. Those are going to be presented to you in the next year. And the reason, based on the next slide, is that the Oregon legislature looked at Martin v. Boise and Blake and wondered what happens if these ever do get appealed, what to the Supreme Court, what if this case law is reversed. We want to protect homeless individuals. We want to codify that case law. So it is now not just case law. We're not just having to comply with case law. As of July 1st, 2023, we have to comply with what's been known to date as HB 3115. It's now ORS 195530. And it didn't really change the rules that I was just talking about. It just tried to distill them into statute. So you can find it in the case law now, in the case books now, and it's everything that we've just talked about. The critical piece that they stated more clearly than the case law did is that reasonableness of local restrictions is based on the totality of circumstances, including but not limited to the impact of the law on persons experiencing homelessness. So that's why I have been saying you need to look at it from the perspective of the homeless individual. Is that alternative shelter? Is that reasonable? Are there other places to go? But the bite that they added to it is that by July 1st, 2023, all Oregon counties and cities need to have reviewed their code books and decided, what do you want to do with prohibitions on use of public property that could be seen as not reasonable when applied to homeless individuals. So we're gonna do an audit of your code book. You'll see I have a couple provisions already. Nothing is in stone that needs to be changed. Nothing's in stone that has to be amended or added to. But the thing that you do have to do based on this law is do that audit and then run the analysis of what are our options. I'm sorry, the bite that they added in is that for those cities and counties who don't amend their code, a homeless individual, if something stays on the books they think that's not reasonable, they need to send you notice that says, hey, you have this code provision, you didn't change it, we don't think it's reasonable from the perspective of a homeless individual, and if you don't change it in 90 days, we're going to sue you. And if you lose that suit, so they challenge the law, you lose the suit, you would be responsible for their attorney's fees. So there's some money in it, not to mention the time and hassle associated with defendant litigation. And it was drawn to my attention yesterday that CIS has been written out of this. So CIS is your insurer. They would, if there was a tort element here, if there was a claim for damages, CIS would defend the city in those suits. But because they can only bring injunctive or declaratory relief, that's not covered in your CIS policy. And so they were trying to put local governments really on the hook to not be able to pass the buck. Just thought that was clever.
And like individual people too, right? Like even like city staff, and like that's what my understanding is, that each individual person, based on what they like say or do, can all. That's why I asked for you guys to be here.
Explain that.
So like not just the city would be responsible, but
No.
the individual person that.
No, in this is just declaratory or injunctive challenge against the city. So you may be talking about the Oregon Tort Claims Act, where individual employees and officials potentially could be named. Fortunately, you have protection against that, but that's outside the scope of what we're talking about tonight. So just with regard to this new cause of action, brand new, they cannot bring these claims right now. After July 1st, 2023, then these challenges, you can expect that we're going to be getting notices if we haven't taken any action between now and then. Yeah.
Carrie, so we have to go look at our books, do an audit, but we don't have any clear direction. And they may or may not, like I wrote down, we may be able to, we may be able to use some time and place manner restrictions, but you may not be able to, but then they're gonna go back and look at these, and then we can get sued personally, which.
Not personally.
No, that's what I was clear.
So I'm just going to jump ahead to try to reassure you.
The city will get.
What we're going to do.
No, you should all have a personal liability umbrella insurance. If you don't have one, talk to your insurance agent about that. So the city councilors cannot be named personally?
You know, I haven't seen one of these because they haven't come in, but if city councilors were named, we would, let me just back up. Anybody can sue, can bring anything in short. Then the defense to that would be, this says you have to challenge the city.
Okay.
The city needs to be the named defendant. And individuals, staff, or counselors should be able to be dismissed.
That's mostly what I was worried about, was staff, like if they were walking up to someone and that's what I was worried about there. So thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. And then just jumping ahead to address the other concern that I heard loud and clear, which is we have zero guidance and we don't know what we can do, even though we have to do this audit. So that's going to be the panoply of options that you're going to have before you. Staff will bring to you, and they'll say, if you do this, you can do that. If you do this, you can do that. If you do nothing, here are the amendments that we recommend.
But then how do you know though? Because we just said that we don't know how to apply that.
Well, it's that we don't know. It's that given the case law so far, without having done any changes to your code, the default position is don't enforce X, Y, and Z provisions.
The challenge is it's so ambiguous that at the end of the day, the only way to determine what we can do and not do is when it comes to court challenge. Really what it comes down to.
Yeah, but I think that if we go through this process of doing an audit and having a discussion and looking at pros and cons and looking at risks, I think it helps us significantly in the long run. Yes, we could still get sued, but if we've kind of done a good job at analyzing and doing the most fair and thorough job we can, then it's going to minimize that risk.
Sure, and that's based on what we know right now, which again is as clear as mud. So.
And I'm sorry, I'm so sorry that I can't distill it down any better. I think LSE did a great job of saying, here's what we know, 3 things. Here's what we don't know, 12. You know, just as a illustration of, yeah, it is going to be decided in the courts moving forward, but taking steps now to try to comply is really going to go a long way with the Oregon Law Foundation, who is surveying city codes and city actions and what options have been considered.
So I wanted to pause here. So Carrie's given a lot of the background on the case law up to this point, and so I wanted Gwen to talk about, based on that history and based on where we're at now, what the police department is doing to try to address the issues and complaints that we talked about previously that we're getting. So Gwen, if you can speak to that for a few minutes, that would be great.
Yeah, absolutely. And I've been in law enforcement 29 years, so there's things in here that, like, you know, we used to just go out and deal with, and it was pretty cut and dry. It's like, you can't do that, right? It's not permissible, and we had our ways and means of how we address those things, and then these rulings come, and it's like, wait, put on the brakes, and then the ambiguity of it. So again, we need to be conscious of our approach to the enforcement of things as a protection to the city, right? Our agency and the city. So we are confined by rules and laws where the people that we're addressing and the behavior that we're addressing, oftentimes those rules and laws are loose for them. So what I will tell you is the best way to think about it is we can approach a person and their ability to sit, lie, you know, seek shelter. We address behavior. And so time and again, that's kind of how we're explaining it. If the person is violating ordinance, violating crimes, we can address that, but not that there's a person laying on a blanket at the park. We can address that they're using drugs. We could address that they're creating a noise disturbance, that they've started a fire, and so we're addressing behavior. Of course, there's still the burden of proof upon us that when we show up and there's not a person around, there's litter, how do we prove who caused the litter, right? And so we still have those burdens of proof upon us when we're taking action. So it shows you up there that we could address under ordinance, noise, damage, so ORS, criminal mischief, fires, public drinking, scattering rubbish, urinating in public, and those things we have. We've worked with the parks, we are complaint driven. It helps when we get reports from people that are seeing things, because we're not always able to be out there and see everything, so that's wonderful and very helpful to us. But again, it's when we get there, what are we seeing, and what can we establish, and what can we prove? The other portion of that too is we've got other calls for service we're addressing too. So sometimes it may be a delay to hike down into Riverfront Park because of our staffing or what our availability is. So Bob's been wonderful again in the parks. He's able to see some of that more routinely. He's gotten into where he can actually pin drop us that location on a map to where we can go do follow-up. So that's super helpful to us. Outside of what we can enforce, we're trying to educate private property owners. So I know for a while there was concerns at some of the strip malls about cars in the parking lot and people kind of congregating, and it gets messy in that, well, let's say this business says it's okay for this person to be on their property, but this specific business doesn't want them in their business, but you've got premise open to the public in the parking lot or the walkway. And so addressing that with the owners to give us letters of consent and trespass if we have an issue there, that we can address it to the whole premise. So we've been working with that. But also their rights. So at a shopping mall, we don't have the right to go in and tow vehicles. That's a private property owner. And so again, educating the owners on what their rights are. And I guess we don't get into giving advice, but they need to be cautious of what those civil repercussions to them are as well, and following those rules. Enforcing reasonable parking limitations, but again, we've got to do the proper notice and making sure that people have opportunity to comply, and then our follow-up with, you know, how we do that. So largely, we don't want to take people's property, we don't want to take people's cars, so what's our compliance on how to accomplish that, but yet clear up the roadway or wherever the vehicle may be. So responding to citizens' complaints, like I say, like we're not going to see everything. We may not know what's going on in particular areas, so those complaints are great. But we do the proactive. We've been doing daily walks through the parks, down at Riverfront, Community Center, the pool, out at Pioneer Park. So we're trying to be out there and visible and give it attention. So I think we've had some success with that, but again, it's we'll clear them out of one place, they move to another. Recently had a conversation with ODOT, who has control over the park and ride, and that's been some questions to me too, like, well, how do they clear that out? And it was great when I had the conversation with ODOT. They're like, yeah, there's no magic, there's no great. He goes, we have to follow all the same rules. We got to post the cars. If they've got a camp set up there, it's actually a 10-day posting to give that person the opportunity to move their personal property. Again, it's not move the person, it's move their personal property. That's what we're addressing. And then if they don't, then it's that matter of we are required, if we clean up an area, we have to keep all that property for safekeeping in case that person decides to come get it. So currently in our, it should be evidence, we're actually holding on to personal property, you know, bedrolls, a whole conglomeration of stuff that we've scooped up that we're required by law to hold on to should they want to come and retrieve that. So, you know, ODOT, they do actually do a real good job down there, but it's a time, consuming thing. He talked to me about, okay, we do this day, we do posting, this day we go around to all our different properties, this day we do cleanup, and they've got access to jail crews that actually come and help them do cleanup. So that's a benefit to them.
I have a question.
Yeah, go ahead.
How long do you have to keep the personal property?
30 days.
Okay.
Yeah, so
Alright,
it's a little while.
It's a while, but it's not like, okay, good. Man, it's not still
Yeah.
like evidence?
But it does take up a fair amount of space, you know, depending what you're collecting up. So when I was out here recently with an officer, we collected up, I think it was 4, you know, oversized trash bags full of stuff. And so that's one instance. Then you've got to properly store that, and then it becomes onus on our evidence person to track it and then get rid of it and purge it appropriately. So what we're finding is oftentimes people are attracted to their resources. So, you know, where can they get Wi-Fi? Where can they plug in? So, you know, those are attractive places that we find sometimes people congregating. And so we've worked with different entities. I know the post office was struggling for a while because they kept having people posting up there, and it was to gain access to that outside plugin. So trying to problem solve, we do that, and talk to people about how you can make it less of an attractive place to hang out. Working with businesses about like the after hours, how with the letter of consent that we have that right to tell the people to move along after hours, even if the owner's not present. And I think the big things to remember from this too is a lot has changed in the last couple of years with COVID standards, what we can actually take people to jail for. So if in fact we go to a park and we're able to establish this person's committing a crime or ordinance violation, they need to move on. We can't exclude them. We have a 30-day park exclusion that we can do. So if they were to return in that 30 days, it's technically a trespass. But the reality of that is a trespass right now in Marion County is a ticket. It doesn't mean we put them in handcuffs and we take them anywhere. And so you question like what are we accomplishing in that scenario necessarily? Yes, they'll have to show up for court later, may or may not, and then is the DA office going to prosecute, right? That's the next follow-up. So some other issues that it presents too is the person goes, I'm not leaving. Are we going to get in a use of force situation to then unhandcuff them and give them a ticket to tell them to go down the road? So, we're trying to play within all the rules and laws and yet problem solve to make it long-term fixes if we can, and short-term, to address the issues.
Gwen, can you speak to the walkthrough? So you definitely walk through daily, you see what's going on, if you see criminal activity, you engage them in conversation. But you engage them in conversation, I mean, especially new people that you're unfamiliar with, to see where they're at, if they need resources. You're sort of that first interaction. Can you speak to that a little bit?
Oh, sure. Yeah, and I mean, I think you go down to Pioneer Park, we have our usuals that we know, right? Or down at Riverfront, if we see them, there's certain people that we know that we would definitely engage. Sometimes, like I was saying earlier, it changes. We'll get people that are staying here for a week or new to the community, passing through. And so we're not going to just wander up to everybody at the park, right? We don't want to do that. We would like people to be at our city parks enjoying the beautiful park. But if we see an issue, we see drinking in public, we see something that we need to address, that's what we're doing. But yes, I mean, as much as we can, we're trying to provide resources, reach out to them. In my experience, from what we've offered, routinely it's not something that they want to participate in or take advantage of.
Can you ask them to move on to a different location within the park?
We would be hard pressed without there's a reason to do that, right? If there were a reason, we could just make them leave the park.
Just a consideration for the rest of the community.
Right. So it gets into, so if I go into a park and, there's someone with their beach towel laying out, catching some sun, is that someone I can tell that based upon it's disturbing to somebody that they need to leave, as opposed to, there's a person that looks undesirable with their blanket that's laid out. Like, who do I get to tell that they get to leave?
I'm thinking from a standpoint of use of that piece of property.
Again, if it's behavior that we can address through ordinance or Oregon revised statute that's criminal. Yeah. And we've gotten recently some calls down at Pioneer Park with the gazebo, and You just drove through there today, right, Julia? She said, no one's in the gazebo, which is, it's a day-to-day thing. And, in talking to ODOT, they're like, we recognize we clear them out at Park and Ride and they come into the city. And the city clears them out and they go to Park and Ride. And it's a team approach, quite frankly, and trying not to get it established is our big thing, because as it gets established, it gets bigger, and then the trash issues and the accumulation issues become a big issue.
And I'll also note that this is what we're currently doing. And one of the reasons why we're having this work session is both that there is some law that we need to do some different things, but it may not be working as well as it could, and maybe there's other things that we can be doing. And if we did take action where we said, you can be anywhere in the park except for the gazebo, then I'm just making that up. Then we might be able to enforce that. So
I am curious about, well, I guess I'm not really curious, it's more like, I'm glad that we're gonna go into the stuff that we can do to help support, because it really sounds like there isn't a lot that we can do to enforce a lot of things, because even if you enforce it, then you can't take them anywhere anyway, it's not really solving any problems, so we kind of have to just move to like, how do we partner with other people facing the same problems and create some type of solution, which I'm glad we're gonna get to next, because I can see why there's probably a lot of people that might be a little bit frustrated, like, this sounds like you can't solve it. Well, I guess that's why we're here, right, to solve it. Because there's not, what we're doing now isn't working, and we can't keep putting restrictions down because you can't enforce them.
I envision a multi-pronged approach, and I don't think there is a solution. I think there is what is the best that we as a community can feel comfortable with. You know what I mean? I don't think that if it could be solved, somebody would have solved it by now. I think we'll be able to solve it as best we can for our community, but I think that there's always going to be underlying issues and concerns that we need to be looking at.
Real quick, Captain Johns, before we get away from it, I had a really important question on this. So earlier you mentioned your current policy, right, for the retention of property of these homeless individuals is to place those materials in your evidence locker. And so I just wanted to go ahead and ensure this current practice, that's not like operationally prohibitive to you in any way when you're investigating criminal violations as far as retention of evidence. Is this getting in the way of that in any way or anything like that?
Currently we're not seeing that, no.
Good.
Yeah.
Cool, thanks. Just want to check.
Thank you.
So I wanted to be clear that when I talk about solutions, I mean, it's gonna have to be a lot of different communities and levels of government probably working together over time to fix it. Not that we can just solve it here in Stayton.
Right.
Like, we can barely keep our library open and our pool running, like, we can't just build housing, right? So I just wanted to clarify that, yeah, it'll be multi-pronged, but we can't just rely on enforcement.
And we'll jump to the what things can we do. I just wanted to highlight just quickly under just as city manager, my concerns is that already what the police department is doing is taking up a lot of time and resources, parks, even library, staff, they get a lot of complaints and just kind of having to manage that and navigate that. The cleaning up the debris that's left behind, and I am concerned when I hear about staff having to handle biohazards, for lack of a less nice word. And I know they're all wearing proper PPE and taking actions appropriately, but it's still a concern. So that's just, I wanted to acknowledge that for my staff that have to deal with it. We've sort of been asking the questions as we've gone along, so maybe we'll just jump to the new stuff.
Julie, I have another one before we get off that last slide a moment ago. So I'm just kind of curious, how many staff hours are currently being devoted on average to cleaning human waste and other excrement? And if known, what is the fiscal impact to this for the city?
We don't have that information at this moment. I have asked staff to start keeping better track of that so that we can have that information.
And my thought is that information is going to help you in evaluating options. If you want to move resources from there over here, just be helpful to have kind of silos of time, money, et cetera, space. So one of the points that, it's obvious at this part of the talk of why we're doing this is to let you know if you've been hearing complaints from citizens that staff isn't responsive or they're not doing things the way they used to do it. They're doing the best they can. And there's a lot that they're having to learn and navigate and timelines. So this ORS 505 is the statute that reflects what Captain Johns was talking about in terms of how they have to handle established camps. And it has actually been on the books, but what increased, it used to be 24 hours notice needed to be given before you broke up an established camp, dispersed an established camp. Now it's 72 hours, and then all of that personal property management requirements that we were just talking about also is from this modified, this amended statute. And the most important piece for me, for you to understand, is that we don't know what an established camping site is. So the legislature tells us here's what you have to do for an established camping site, but they don't say a person sleeping there for 2 hours is an established camping site. A person sleeping there for 72 hours is an established camping site. What the standard rule of thumb is that if somebody's been in a location for 12 hours or more, maybe you need to start thinking about giving them this notice. And so maybe going through the local parks and allowing people to have been sleeping there, but at some point then you're like, okay, now we can move you along. So you're allowed to not camp here, but you get to sleep, lie down, rest, stay warm. But you don't get to transition into an established campsite. So that is just another one of those fine edges that we're walking. And there's some area in between before the notice is required, before personal property needs to be retained for 30 days. That hopefully we're going to get some more clarity about. So the minimum, we've kind of talked about this, the minimum under state law and the new statutes is to not sanction for camping, sleeping on public property when no alternative shelter is available, and to go through your code and amend ordinances that regulate lying, sleeping, keeping warm and dry on public property that is open to the public. So that's the very, very minimum. A lot of communities are saying that we don't have to do anything, and I'm like, well, you do have to do this little preliminary step. But what's better and what's being proposed in your community is to take a look, well, so I guess let me just talk about the certain provisions that I just, on a very brief review of your code, saw that you, if nothing else was done, that you would be amending or removing. The prohibition on camping upon any public property or under a bridge unless a permit is obtained. That's not a barrier, that's prohibitive, and probably is not reasonably objective from the perspective of a homeless individual. Park hours, those have gone out the window, as you just were hearing about what's not currently being enforced. The exclusion of persons from parks and public facilities, that's a penalty if in response to other violations, not simply the sitting, lying, sleeping in a public park. But the exclusionary penalty was what was at issue in Blake v. Grants Pass. And so we're going to need to look at all of this holistically. And I'm not saying, like I've been repeating, we're not saying these have to be amended, we're not saying they have to be repealed, but we're going to look at everything and look at where are you going to allow people to be, where do you want your restrictions to be enforced, which parks do you want to prioritize, which areas of those parks or some parks are going to be lower priority that might constitute alternative locations, what local social service nonprofits usually are available, what churches are available, what individual private citizens are available. There's tons of programs that are popping up statewide that utilize parking lots, individual private homes, all sorts of nonprofit space that it may be available in your community and that may then allow you to enforce one or more of the ordinances that I just identified.
Carrie, can I ask you a question?
Absolutely.
So if I have reasonable shelter, which you haven't established what that is, reasonable, the word that you used. If I have a place to live, can I camp in the park? Or is it only people who don't have a place to live?
That
Because
is,
I mean, is it like, is this applicable to everyone? Like, if we take this off, anyone can camp in the park?
yeah, that is a really tough piece because currently it just wouldn't be enforced against individuals who have no other location. But if you have this on the books and if you receive a challenge, they'll look at it from the perspective of a homeless individual. So I think the goal is that you could have those restrictions on the books. You could enforce them against people who do have alternative shelters because you have assessed there is also alternative locations for people who are homeless. So you're going to be doing like this.
So I can't access the park after 10. So it's not permissible for me to be there, but it's permissible for someone else to be there based on certain stipulations.
Right. Currently, that's the case because of the enforcement is fettered. Moving forward, hopefully that won't be the case because you will have done a much broader evaluation of which rights of ways do you want to protect, which parks do you want to protect, which park areas. And in certain locations, everyone will be subject to curfews or closures. And in certain areas, perhaps nobody will be. I'm not quite sure how that's going to play out, but you've hit right on the head why we're having this conversation. Because
so do noise violations also matter too? Like 3 a.m., someone who's unhoused, like screaming at the top of their lungs, obscenities, multiple nights in a row.
I'm turning
That's
to
okay.
law enforcement because and I'll say my take, I'm not just punting, but my take is that isn't a natural incidence of being unhoused. The screaming and noise violations is, as she was saying, you focus on behavior, you don't focus on the person.
So that's something that we can address.
Then you get back to the same thing that this lovely staff member was saying, is that you walk up to them and you talk to them and you can cite them, but then you're just giving them a ticket for something that they probably aren't going to pay first off. They can't go to jail for, and so now you have this also this breakdown between you and that community member. Like, that's why there has to be other solutions because what enforcement isn't working. I mean, I heard from a community member recently that a bush was lit on fire and the person didn't even, nothing happened because they couldn't be taken to jail for whatever reason. There wasn't enough housing or beds or whatever they call it in there. So I have a question though on the camping. Like our laws that we have listed were on the slide before maybe, or the ordinances, to be more particular. Is there something that we can do to these? And I'm just kind of trying to figure out where we're going with this. Is there something we can do with these to say, except, adding something like except as defined in ORS, 505, you can't do this unless you fall under the category of 505 where you're houseless, you don't have adequate housing, blah, blah, blah. Is there an easier fix to the wording of it that just goes, yeah, you can't do that unless you have a right to do that because of this law?
Yeah, I don't know, but that's a really good idea.
Okay.
And we'll be nobody has come up with the ironclad, here's what you can do. Because you're only going to make any amendments. No amendments are going to come before you until you've decided what is the program that we want for our city. Who are our partners? What are the areas we want to protect? You're going to go through all of that. And then only once we know where you stand in terms of alternative shelters, other resources, then we'll be able to say, okay, given all of that, it looks like you're fine, looks like this is defensible, or let's tweak this a little bit, or let's open up this other area, and then you can keep that prohibition. So it is a broad spectrum analysis. We can't just do targeted amendments until you've walked through the process to know all of your resources.
Carrie, or maybe Julia.
More
Maybe
music.
John, maybe Billy didn't know. I have a thing about not making ordinances or rules that, like, we can't enforce. I feel like we shouldn't be doing that, then it's just words, I guess. But what's the intention or like the reasoning behind having restrictions for camping or for these things, having restrictions on hours that you can be in the park? Like, it kind of, I just think about, like, why do we have these? Is it a safety issue? Is it like, what is it? Because if it's a safety issue, then it's a safety issue for everyone, and then no one should be there. It shouldn't. And I know that's not applicable, but I'm just thinking in terms of what Councilor Hook said, like, if it's not a safety issue, if we're just doing it because we don't want people in our parks at that time, then we should just scrap the whole thing, in my opinion.
I think, to Gwen's point when she was initially talking, I think it used to be enforceable. I think that it's on the books because it used to be enforceable, and the issue now is that it's not enforceable in the same way that it was originally. And so what we need to look at is exactly what you're saying, is what do we need and why do we need it? And if it is a safety issue, we do need to keep them out of the parks or these locations, that's fine, we can justify that, but we need to make sure that we have alternatives available.
I don't want to make a law just because it's enforceable. Like,
Right.
It has to have a reason. There has to be a reason behind this to make it make sense. And if it doesn't make sense, the giraffe on the light pole type of thing, take it off the books.
And I don't know, it's a lot of history. I mean, I think most cities have no camping in public parks, partly because they didn't want people camping in public parks. They didn't want this type of situation, but that's what we have.
It may just be because the restroom's closed, because, staffing issues, they wanted to minimize the amount of cleaning they needed to do in the morning.
Right.
But you're the lawmakers, and you get to look back now and decide, it made sense to somebody a long time ago, no, we don't know why. Does it make sense now?
Well, one of the things that goes through my head is, like, we have biohazard materials that our staff are cleaning up, and we have closed restrooms. So to me, I'm like, does our staff like to clean that up versus have the restroom there, and then maybe, every once in a while you have to do a sweep through or put, maybe not even, you close the restroom down, but you put a porta potty out there that's open 24/7. That would be something that, isn't big enough for people to camp in, but it's big enough for someone to use in an emergency. You know what I mean? Like, there's gotta be something better that we can do even for that, because that's what's really concerning to me right this moment, is hearing that we have staff members that are cleaning that up. And I'm not surprised by it, but, like, we should try to find a way to fix that.
And that's why staff will generate options to bring to you. This is what we can afford. This is what works for us. This works with the hours that we have people employed. This is how we see it working out. And they can propose to you, here's option A based on everything that we have. Okay, you don't like that, or that's too risky, or that's whatever, it's too conservative. Here's option B that we also see could work. So anyway, you will be hearing from them as to what their preferences are, what they can staff.
And sometimes there's unintended consequences to certain fixes. So the bathroom staying open 24/7 might be a great fix, but it also might be an attractive nuisance because it's a good shelter, and pretty soon we got people making fires in there, and then there's some other unintended consequence.
Right.
So, and I
Like
appreciate,
versus-
I don't really want to be cleaning up human waste, nor does Bob or other staff. So we appreciate those thoughtful, ideas. as long as we're thinking through the unintended consequences that may come as well.
Which is the difference between a honeypot and a big bathroom that has all that open space to do things in, because like.
Can I address that?
You've been up to Delta Park.
Can I address that?
Really?
So, yeah,
This is Lance sitting at my house here. We have spent thousands of dollars on restroom fixes over the last couple of years because of the homeless. We have also spent $1,200 for a porta potty that was vandalized. So we're spending a lot of dollars from the parks budget on just this action. So I just want to make that point, that we have been doing that. We have done that, and we've spent a lot of money trying to fix these issues.
And I'll also add that when we tackle this as a staff and as a community, we're going to look both internally but externally. What's worked in other places? This isn't, we're not inventing the wheel. We want to learn from other people's experiences and see if what we put forward is sort of the newest best solution rather than just kind of trying to fix things. I'm just thinking as Councilor Herc was talking in Sherwood, they did a bathroom in the plaza with specific lighting so that people couldn't go in and see their veins and shoot up. So it's like just kind of like learning from, and I don't know if that might have been excessive for, but just like there might be situations where, or bathroom facilities where you can see legs, so it's private, to a certain, where it needs to be private, but you can see if there's people in there, or you can see how many people are in there, that kind of thing. And then, there are facilities throughout Europe and throughout this country as well, where that might be something that is looked at as an option if that's where we want to.
So let's just, we're talking about options, and we're talking about really specific options. And let's back out just to give you a broader sense of what various communities are doing. So we talked about minimum action under court case and state law would result in just taking off the books all of those prohibitions. You would allow camping, sleeping, lying, keeping warm and dry on all outdoor public property in Stayton. That would include parks, rights of ways, which we know, we've been told by case law, some restrictions in rights of ways in particular could be objectively reasonable, sidewalks and planting strips. My assumption is that isn't what anybody wants for your community, but I just want you to know that remains on the table and you could direct staff. I'm sick of thinking about this. I want you to just go do what we need to do to the code and never bring this back to us again. Okay, that's an option. You could review objectively reasonable time, place, and manner regulations, and you could ensure that you have prohibitions on blocking sidewalks and rights of ways. You could prohibit safety risks. HB 3115 specifically says keeping warm and dry does not include the ability to light fires, so you could regulate that. As we were talking about, you could set overnight limits in some but not all city parks, so you can prioritize those parks that you have available. Enforce reasonable parking limits with notice, which is already being done. But some cities were under the impression they couldn't move any cars, and that's not the case. You get to say, nope, you get to park, and then you're going to have to move on. And then you can, like I was saying, talking with partners in the community, in the local, county, and state level of who can help you provide alternative shelter sites so that you can more strictly regulate public areas and manage your public areas. So that's kind of moving the lens back out on the kinds of options that are going to be brought to you. The next example is just language that's being adopted in various communities that is allowing camping in a vehicle on a right-of-way, but under limited circumstances. It's conforming with parking regulations. It's not within a certain amount of distance between, from public or private schools. It's not being repaired. It's operational and can legally operate. And then nothing's spilling out from the doors or the back onto the streets. And so that's what a lot of cities think they get to enforce, but they don't have anything that says that specifically in their books. And that is a great way to protect your right-of-way, to keep it available, but also to protect your right-of-way. And then to ensure that it remains within vehicles, it's not allowing tent structures or other shelters being constructed or erected in your right-of-way. I kind of want to call out, there's laws that we didn't talk about, we don't have here, but they are, I did mention, either churches, religious institutions, private entities, or individuals can come to the city. You could set up a program where they are asking, can we turn our parking lot into a campsite? Or can we utilize our facilities as a campsite? Or the city can do that also in certain locations. And there are health regulations that apply to those. So those need to have certain level of sanitation available and on site. And usually they require management as well. That's what I prefer. And I also tend to recommend that the city not get involved in that the city permit private entities or nonprofit entities to conduct and open up those facilities, but that the city doesn't run them itself. But I just want you to know, recent legislation just made that all an option. And so that's something that we could bring back to you, an ordinance that is setting up a program like that. Okay, I'm going to turn it over to Julia.
Yeah, so this last slide is sort of summarizing what was just stated, but really where the question for you guys, and I don't think we're going to get necessarily, I mean, we're not going to get answers to the solutions tonight, but where do we want to go next? And really, I guess the question is, how do we want to go next? Because we need to have discussion on implementation of the new law. We need to have discussion on the current actions being taken and whether or not we want to do something different and how. One suggestion is to do a task force to discuss this, made up of some council members, maybe some staff, resource agencies that are available, both religious institution, housing advocates, that kind of thing, to see if we can't identify that, or we could do an additional work session where you start to kind of help focus on what you're thinking. But I think it might be helpful for you to get some input before you start prioritizing. But I wanted to kind of open it up. It's a lot of information that we've given you, and a lot of questions that you need to answer.
I would love to see a task force for it, and I would love to be on that task force where we're considered to be on that.
Other thoughts, questions?
Or even just timing.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, we don't want to rush anything. We know staff is going to need some time to develop the information you've asked for already in terms of costs associated with the cleanups currently undertaken. But I just am going to put out there again, whatever you do, at least with regards to your code, we want to have that done July of 2023.
That's actually what I was going to say. I think, can we get that stuff done first? That's where I'd like to go next, is the time sensitive stuff. So we can get it at least temporarily fixed, even if we're going to go and change something later.
And I can see it being a parallel with where we, if there is general support, where we form a task force and they sort of start having some marching orders and start tackling some stuff, but maybe a part of that, or the first thing that they tackle, is these intermediate fixes with because if we just fix the code and remove the barriers without the community understanding that we're looking at a bigger, longer-term fix, there might be concern. But if we're sort of doing it, at the same time and doing the time-sensitive stuff first, or concurrently with that, while the task force is sort of looking at the holistic approach of both, potentially code amendments, compliance stuff, as well as resources and how we support the homeless population.
Yeah, Julia, I think that concurrently is the way to go. And I'd like to have as much community involvement as possible in the task force.
Absolutely. I'd also like to, I'd be interested in that task force as well. But when we're talking about like nonprofits and organizations, I would like to see the SIT team be involved in that. I know that there's a lot of groups out there, like in our area that do, that work with homeless populations and whatnot, but the SIT team is actively involved in our community and knows our community and those resources and the people who live here. I'd like to see them involved and not necessarily an outside source coming in.
Yeah, and I actually talked with Kim Dwyer, who's our SIT team chair, coordinator, leader. And I think, I wasn't sure she was going to be here tonight or not, but I think there definitely is an interest in a desire for them to participate. It sounds like there are not a lot of homeless resources here in our community, and so that's something that she's sort of struggling with too. But if we can get them to participate, maybe they see that there is a need for that resource. But certainly starting with who is here in our community and making sure that we have that local representation.
I think there's also value just not only in the knowledge that they have, but how well they ran their program during the wildfires. Like there's a lot to learn from them, and if they're willing to work with us so that we can learn and try to find other solutions with even other nonprofits that we can put down a similar type of system, even if it's not the SIT team that's particularly helping with it, but it can give us ideas, and they do know a lot about what the needs are in the community.
So, and I actually just attended the first in-person SIT team meeting last week, I think. There's a lot of people on the SIT team. It was like 30 plus people. So I don't know that invited the whole team to come, but we can certainly target representatives that would be local on that team. And I guess my question to you all is, how big of a task force are we thinking about? Are we more focused on just size doesn't matter, let's get as much representation as we can, or have something a little bit more targeted and focused? And with that feedback, I can then go talk with Kim and talk with, internally and things like that, and maybe for probably not the next council meeting, but the following council meeting, come forward with a proposal for this task force makeup of kind of what we're thinking. But it would be helpful to get a little bit more input on size and representation.
Hey, Julia. I know you and I spoke the other day about the Housing and Neighborhood Vitality Advisory Commission. It was new to me. It's on our website. How many people are on that commission? Do you know?
So I think that, actually, I was just looking at that today in the code, and Dan will chime in. I think there's 5 people that are identified in the code, and it's really supposed to be Stayton residents. But I'm not sure if they are active and if they even exist. But Dan, can you chime in? I see you there.
Sure. There are 4 people who were appointed to the commission. The commission met a few times in 2018-19 and has not met since COVID times.
Okay. I think at some point I'd like to have this issue be one of their main topics, in addition to the task force that we appoint, from a long-term perspective of keeping it at the focus. And, it's vitality, neighborhood vitality encompasses that as well. So
I'd like to make sure that we have representation from the attorneys while we talk about this topic, regardless of what level it's at, whether it's a task force for the commission or one of these meetings here, a council meeting, work session.
Real quick, Julia, I guess I'm kind of curious. Do you think by the next time we meet to discuss this issue or the formulation of a prospective task force, do you think that staff have the ability to have all these items quantified that are fiscal impact of the city at this point? Is that too soon of a deadline to put on you? Or is that something that would have to come
We
before the
can
task force?
start. I mean, I can start quantifying it, but I don't know that I would call it accurate. If we have, we can extrapolate out and kind of come up with some some guesses, but I wanted, I think we would need to continue to track that data.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I feel like at this point, for me as an individual counselor, I need to know some more information about fiscal impact before directing staff to do anything particularly. The task force seems like a good direction to go in, but again, I really want those numbers in front of me. That's my first question here.
And so by fiscal impacts, you're talking about both.
So
what we
damage to
fix.
the property, right, that Lance was earlier referencing, I wanna know what that looks like. I wanna know how much time Bob spends out there cleaning up the human feces. I wanna know what it costs to dispose of those items, all costs associated with it, because ultimately what I really wanna know is how much are we as a city spending on our homeless community to support them in this way? And I wanna know that because to make a decision on, like, for example, any potential future council is going to want to know, okay, do we want to set up a space for these folks, right, devoted to them? And so to make the decision on how much to spend on something like that, they're going to need that other figure, right, to compare and contrast.
Okay.
And so I guess I'm asking this question in the thoughts of, hey, there's 3 of us up for an election. Maybe the next people would like that info too, to do a comparison. Right? So that's where I'm coming from.
So this, I'm gonna say this next thing only because it's the second time that I've kind of heard talked about this way. When we're talking about those expenses and attributing them to the homeless, we also need to be careful that we are accurate, that it is actually homeless individuals that are creating that issue. Because if you don't have evidence pointing to the fact that it was an actual homeless individual that left biohazards in a park, then you cannot say that that's a homeless issue problem. It's just a biohazards in the park problem. So we have to be very careful about how we talk about this stuff here because all of this is all recorded and all permissible and anything in the future. So all I have to say is just let's be careful when we talk about some of this stuff. It's not always attributed to the homelessness issue. Some people just do weird things.
Yeah, that's a good point, Councilor. I think maybe comparing and contrasting previous years where folks were having to clean up, I mean, maybe looking at it that way, if it's human feces or not, and especially like, I'm sure that Bob probably, or excuse me, the staff member assigned with that job probably is aware too, so, I mean, I feel like staff could probably differentiate that pretty well, but thank you for pointing that out.
And I think that's a very well taken point. I think that we're going to be doing best, it's going to be caveated with, we haven't been tracking this data, and this is kind of what we're thinking now, and this is we're extrapolating. And you're right, it's like this is how much time we're spending cleaning up litter. This is how much time we're spending, or how much money we're spending repairing damage. And so I think that quantifying it in that way is probably very appropriate. So all I'll just say is we'll do the best we can, and we'll go from there. But we're not going to be able to quantify, do the compare and contrast from past years because we haven't been doing that. But I think it is something that we can say, okay, this is kind of generally how much we're spending, and then this council and future councils will be able to use that information to kind of say, maybe that's not worth us spending years and millions on something, or maybe it is, or that would be something you guys can.
I think the biggest thing is probably going to be our police force's hours. How much actual time are they spending dealing with these issues, and how much can be potentially alleviated by X, Y, and Z solution?
Well, and yes, I mean, that's probably a big chunk of it, but our public works crew is spending a lot of time cleaning up camps and just dealing with more garbage potentially that could be used other places too. And so but you're right, it's going to be hard to differentiate, so we'll do the best we can. So I'm thinking for, again, not the October or September 19th, but the October 3rd meeting, to try to get some bulk, something for you guys at that point to lay out a foundation for a task force and a framework, as well as a timeline to start trying to flesh that out, and I'll try to have some numbers then as well.
what is a good size for a task force?
Well, that's relative. Too many makes, if you have a lot, if you have a lot, you want and get a lot of voices and a lot of opinions, and it will likely take more time to really truly hear from everybody, which is fine. If you have a smaller number, you're not necessarily getting as much representation, but you're able to roll your sleeves up and get through things faster. So in my mind,
7?
oh,
Is
I
that
was
too
thinking,
many?
7 would be, in my mind, a small task force. I seriously
Well, yeah,
was
what's
on a
sort of
planning
like-
committee with like 18 people, and that was a lot. So somewhere between 7 and 18, might be.
Just to chime in,
Oh, yeah, please.
I oddly have like
Oh.
from 6 to 9, and just keep it under 10.
Oh, okay, there you go.
That's, just the weirdest guideline that just came out of nowhere, except that I work with a lot of bodies.
Okay, there you go.
That is,
Well, and
That is your legal advice.
schedules and.
yeah, it's not legal advice, not legal advice.
Anecdotal,
It's just
not legal.
yeah.
And I think there's probably a lot of these types of task forces around the state already. Can you look at like what kind of community members they have on them and sort of model it in a similar fashion that you see overall of ones that seem like they're coming up with really good ideas, like stuff you sent us in the update last week or on Friday. It would be kind of neat to see what maybe some of those cities have that are really coming forward with some tangible solutions or at least ways to try and address issues that they face.
Yeah, I know Silverton just had a big multi-year task force thing, and they ended up building some tiny houses or something. But they have broad experience with that whole thing, so
Okay.
Might even have Silverton, a representative from Silverton willing to come and speak to the task force on like what they did or something.
That's a great idea.
That's cool.
Yes. It's a work session, not an executive
Last one.
session.
So I got a question and a wild idea in a way here. So this task force, what is the chance that we could coordinate with Sid or somebody to have a person experiencing homelessness on this task force to go ahead and answer to this experience and then give us better, solutions as a policymaking body here? I don't know. I'm happy to go start wandering around the park and talking to folks, but I think maybe the SIT team's a better resource for that.
Yeah, that's a really interesting idea. I will certainly ask about that at the very least, even if they're not able to commit to being on a task force, having them come speak would be a great idea. Yeah.
Just I'm hoping that this is a resource for you as you go through this process. So it'll be something you might pull out every time or just bring it when this discussion is on your agenda so that you can remind yourself, oh, right, here's that line from the law, or this is what we're dealing with, this is what we need to
Thank you
comply
so
with.
much for this, by the way. This is way more than what I had expected from this work session. It was really well put together. And so thank you very much for all the work that was put into this.
Our pleasure. Your city administrator here, city manager, just spent a lot of time like refining it, tailoring it, just so that it could be the most useful tool for this
Locally relevant.
and this body,
Yeah.
this you specifically.
So for resources, so you have this, you've got the LOC bulletin information that I sent in the last weekly update. I think I've sent you a link to the other document that you showed, the LOC, but I'll send that out again.
Do you want me to leave them?
That one, the guide to persons experiencing homelessness in public spaces. Have I sent that to you guys?
I can't remember.
I haven't seen it yet, but I did see the.
I will make sure that you get this in your next weekly update.
And then this is what has already been distributed, just pages from it already came to you,
Right.
so you know.
Super helpful.
But I'm gonna leave this.
Oh, okay, perfect.
Thank you.
Thank you
That's it.
for answering our question.
Thanks. Thank
It was
you.
really great.
I appreciate you all.
Our pleasure, it was fun preparing these two.